Well, Dana, I'm really excited to welcome you, and I can't wait to, well, I'd say keep our conversation going. We've been chatting here kind of before we started recording, just hitting it off, chatting about work and business and health and all that. And so, Dana, I'm really excited to bring you on to talk about ADHD and kids. And I have so many moms listening, and I'm sure there's a lot of moms that don't have kids with ADHD, but I'm sure there are some that do, or, even if they don't, may know someone who does and could pass this information along to them as well. And I also feel like we're going to talk about some good nuggets that are going to be good for all families, regardless if you don't have a child that is dealing with anything, right? Just health in general. So let's start off. Dana, I want you to share a little bit about you and what got you to specialize helping other families with kids with ADHD.
Thanks so much for having me, Erica. I'm really excited to be here. And you are so right that even if you don't have a kid with ADHD, all of the things that I'm going to share will help probably someone in the family. Because I'm sure, as you know, Erica, everything that we do is beneficial for most people. And the increase in disease these days is the result of what we're being exposed to. And so whether or not there's ADHD or not, this is an interesting conversation for most to hear. So thanks for having me. Uh, Interestingly, I was completely removed from the health and wellness space, and I was actually an accountant. I shudder every time I think about that, but I was an accountant, and I probably would still be in that field if it wasn't for the concerns over my son's health that grew over the number of years since he was born. And I used to dream as a child to be a businesswoman with an office, and I achieved that goal. And my son was born bubbling, beautiful boy. And probably at the age of 2, I sort of started to think, is this normal? And he would be the most hyperactive kid on the playground. And he would have these tantrums. And yes, there's, terrible twos, and there's all of these different ages, the 3s and the 4s and all of that. He over time his tantrums got worse and he became more hyperactive. And at first I'd ask the teachers or the doctor, is this normal? And they'd be like, yes, he's just a boy. But in my gut, I just knew that there was something a bit different. And eventually, probably about the age of 4, his tantrums became even more severe. And that's when his teachers started noticing the differences too. And we went to a developmental pediatrician, and he was diagnosed with ADHD, and we were immediately handed a prescription medication for strong medication to help his ADHD. And between you and me, I at first I remember feeling really relieved with the diagnosis. I wasn't a bad mum. It wasn't my parenting that was doing this. And I was excited to actually go fill the medication, thinking, this was finally going to get our family the help that they needed. And so I got it. I gave it to him, and at first things were great, but then we started to see these other symptoms, and we started to get these other side effects. And so we went back to the doctor, and they gave us a second medication to give in the afternoon. And then more symptoms came, more side effects, and they gave us a third medication. So he was 5 by this time, and he was on 3 strong medications.
So you were
And most
starting with one to address the ADHD, and then it was 2 other ones to address side effects from the initial. Is
Yes,
that correct?
yes,
Hmm.
yes,
Oh,
I know. And I just went along with it, trusting the experts. But things weren't getting better. They were getting worse. And by the time I went to the doctor and he handed me a prescription for the 4th medication, that's when I sort of said, this does not seem okay. And that's when I sort of just threw myself into all of the research and studies and published journals. And that's when my career path completely changed. And I went back to school. I did my holistic health degree, my FDN certification. I did multiple specific certifications in this particular area. And I really learned that ADHD symptoms can be reduced naturally. And I began to learn how food can affect so many aspects of our lives. And, my journey went on for years. And today, my son, he's thriving. He hasn't been on meds for years. He's in middle school, just went off to grade 7 today for his first day at school. He's a straight A student. But I think the most important thing is that he's happy and my family is happy, and we now have peace and calm in our house, which we never had before. And once I learned all of this and once I saw the impact it had on my family, I really couldn't keep this information to myself. And I didn't want anyone else to have to go through the struggles that my family went through. And over the years, I've worked with now close to 1,000 other families and helped them get to the same place as me so much quicker.
That's amazing. And we know that food can affect the body both positively and negatively.
Yes.
So yeah, it's amazing. I've seen it with my own kids, the power of food, both positively and negatively, and especially on boys. So I kind of want to start with a question of how do you help a parent identify like and typically it's more boys, right? I know some girls can quote have the diagnosis of ADHD, but what would you say or what do you see in your practice, to help identify symptoms of ADHD? Like what is too much? Because kids are active. We want them
Mm.
to be active, right? So where's that fine balance of this is just too much?
Yeah, look, it is hard to determine, is this normal? And even now I think to myself, oh, is this normal teenage behavior or is it ADHD? And I do have a bit of post-traumatic stress from the whole scenario. But thinking back into the back when they're younger, girls actually tend to go more undiagnosed than boys because they tend to have quieter symptoms. They daydream off into the distance. Theirs is more sort of like quiet symptoms in focus and attention, whereas boys, it's very sort of non-quiet symptoms, very hyperactive, meltdowns, tantrums. The emotional dysregulation is a big component of ADHD, and many parents don't realize that. They go and they think the terrible twos, and then it goes to the threes, and then it continues into the fours. I won't tell you my name for the fours, but I remember the fourth year for my son was the worst out of all of them. You're laughing, so you probably know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
If I could guess, I'm sure we all can probably guess something that rhymes with
Yes.
four.
Yes, yes. And and so there's a lot of symptoms that come with it, but the best way to really know if it is ADHD or if it's not is to really seek advice from your doctor. Actually go to a developmental pediatrician rather than just a general pediatrician. When families tell me that they've been diagnosed by them filling out a form and the teacher filling out a form and giving it to their traditional pediatrician, that is not okay. And that's probably why there is such an increase in ADHD being diagnosed these days, because a general pediatrician are not trained to diagnose ADHD. It really needs to be done over a number of sittings with your child, with a professional who does this on a daily basis. And so, symptoms can range, but a lot of them are those outwardly facing ones, being hyperactive, impulsive, emotional dysregulation, but then also, executive function issues like attention, focus, planning, organizing, problem solving. And so there's some of those common ones that we see.
So even if a child does not have ADHD, but maybe a mom listening is like, oh, my kid has a hard time focusing. Doesn't mean they necessarily have ADHD, but it also can mean that by making some nutritional changes and some things that you'll suggest today could benefit their child, which is why I think this is so awesome. I get so passionate when we start talking about kids because I
Yes.
feel like our kids that are born now or in the last, like my oldest is 15, right? I just feel like just there's so much more toxins in the world, the food, everything. And you just have to be so on it sometimes, especially if you have a child who is more sensitive to just life, right? The
Yeah.
toxins, the stimulus, whatever it might be. So,
Yeah,
um,
definitely.
yeah. So, okay, can we get into what are some of the initial things that you talk to parents about with what are those initial, say, food changes that you're like, okay,
Mm.
these are like usually like a kind of across the board. Again, everyone's bodies are different. I am the first one to know that too. But what are some of those general things that you see? Okay, we've got to get these things out of this child's, diets so that we can calm their system down.
Yeah, look, most of the families that I work with, the kids already got an ADHD diagnosis and they're really suffering. The family's really suffering. And so, we may make some more stronger changes around diet than someone who is just struggling with a little bit of focus issues that may not be diagnosed. But I can tell you, no kid should be eating artificial flavors or artificial colors or preservatives. And so, you will find that most of the candy these days has all of that in it. And so if you want to start somewhere, start with that. And that's actually quite simple. There's so many great alternatives these days. The natural candy store is a great place where you can go on and you can actually say, oh, I want things with no artificial this, no artificial that. Even if there's other sensitivities like dairy or corn or gluten, you can remove those out and it gives you the types of candies that they can eat. So that's a great tip for families. But if we're really, wanting to work to help this child that is suffering with ADHD, the family suffering, there are three foods that I recommend these families remove out of their diet, and that's gluten, dairy, and soy. And that's because these foods are the top three culprits that are driving inflammation in our body. And ADHD really is inflammation in the body. Okay, and I'm just gonna share, like, I've worked with close to 1,000 families, and about 50% of them, we change the diet and that's it. They don't need to go any further and their symptoms reduce enough for them to be going really, really great, and they don't need meds and they don't need, more work. The other 50% may have some underlying issues going on that we need to investigate with functional lab testing, which we can talk about in a bit. And so, what that tells me is that either the kid has been wrongly diagnosed, and it's really that their body's in a state of inflammation from the food that they're eating, or that, the inflammation is being driven by the foods. And yes, they may have ADHD, but when we reduce that inflammation, it's enough for them to be thriving. So, those three foods are the ones that are driving inflammation in the body. When kids have symptoms, when kids having meltdown, a meltdown at the age of 6 or 7 that lasts for an hour is not normal. Okay. And families just think that that's what they've got to deal with when they've got a child with ADHD. No, it's not normal. That's that child's body telling you, Mum, something is going on inside my body and I need it checked out. Okay. And so these inflammatory substances, they can lead to those types of symptoms, but they can also lead to something called leaky gut. And, we can talk about the gut brain connection because it's huge. But, just before I go there, I'll finish off on the foods. And so when we remove these foods out, we can actually heal the gut and we can reduce that inflammation. As I said, I also recommend families avoid artificial flavors and colors. Excess sugar is a big one as well. I like to focus on more natural sugars like honey, maple syrup, or dates. Kids with ADHD are more likely to have compromised systems, immune systems, detoxification systems in their body. So the effects of these substances tend to have a great effect on the whole body. So that's usually my top three or top five or six foods that we swap out.
Well, I totally agree with those. Just kind of almost on like an everybody basis, right? I'm
Agree,
like, if anyone,
100%.
any woman listening is having hormonal dysregulation, having, symptoms like having, I mean, anyone who's listened to me for a while knows that I am totally on the get off the gluten train. I have been gluten free for a very long time. My house is, it's changed, especially one of my kids' life, just getting off of gluten. And I've changed so many others' lives by getting off of it too. And so I cannot agree with you more about all of those suggestions. So
Yeah.
yeah, let's talk about actually, okay, before we get into the gut brain connection, I wanted you to share with our ladies listening, because a lot of them have families, obviously. So, what are some of the common challenges that you see families face with changing their diets, and what are some of the suggestions you have? Because I cannot tell you how many times I suggest to a family. Usually it starts with the mom, or sometimes it's the kid. It depends, right? And then my suggestion really ends up being like, ideally, like working on switching it for the whole family can be really
Mm-hmm.
beneficial. And I get a lot of pushback, right? And I'm sure you do too. So I'd love for you to share some of your words of wisdom for what you suggest to families when it comes to trying to get the gluten out, the dairy, the soy. Soy is the easiest to avoid, I find, but the dairy and the gluten, a little harder sometimes.
Yeah, look, at first it's a challenge, and I'm not gonna lie. But what I will tell families is, just as say Taco Tuesday is their normal right now, you'll turn around in a couple of months and you'll have a new normal, and all of this change won't be change anymore. It'll be your new normal, and you won't even have to think about it. And so that's the stage that we want families to get to. But the one thing that I did when I started doing this for my own son was I literally changed everything on day one. I removed gluten, dairy, soy, artificial flavors, artificial colors, plus 40 of his food sensitivities. Let's just say that's not what I teach in my program, because it is not the right way to do it. I ended up in a heap on my floor, probably with multiple panic attacks, because that is the wrong way to do it. And so I always tell families that Rome was not built in a day, and transforming your family's diet won't be complete in a day either. It is not a race, and it's a marathon. And it's okay to take it slowly. It's okay to take one step at a time. And so if the pace that's doable for you and your life is one change a week, or one change every 2 weeks, then that's okay. You need to give yourself permission to take things slow. This is not a diet. It's not a phase that we're just going to go through. It's a permanent lifestyle change, and when it becomes part of your lifestyle, it becomes second nature, and then these changes don't seem as overwhelming or as hard. And so I always tell families to start, one step at a time. And that might be, let's focus on breakfast, and let's change up breakfast. And once we're comfortable with that, let's move on to something else. Or it could be, when one product finishes, replace it with a better alternative. And then you're slowly making these steps, step by step. And we always teach families in our program how to do it slowly, how to make those one step at a time, because by the end of the 12 weeks working with us, they'll turn around and go, oh wow, like we don't even think about it anymore. This is all part of our life. Going, all of these other challenges aren't challenges anymore. And so definitely one step at a time is what I suggest. There are also, lots of other challenges that families might come against. It might be things like birthday parties. And so we always share strategies with families on how to handle these situations where, they're not really sure how they're going to deal with them. But the birthday parties, we always say, keep gluten, dairy, soy-free cupcakes in the freezer, or cookies. I've got all of them in my freezer at all times. And when we're going to a birthday party, my son just grabs one out the door and takes it with him. And that way he can still enjoy the treats right alongside his friends. I sometimes always calls the family that is having the birthday party and ask them what they're actually feeding the children, and we'll always bring the same thing, but gluten and dairy free. We always have treats in our car, and so if something just jumps up out of nowhere, we've always got candy or something in the car that he can have.
I love all those suggestions and I think they're amazing. And I do a lot of the same ones in my house as well. And, honestly, because I think sometimes, like, as parents, we think it's going to actually be harder for our kids than it is. Do you know what I mean? Because I can't
Hmm.
tell you how many times I've heard, like, oh, well, that's not going to happen in my household. There's no way we could cut bread out, or there's no way. And I'm like, well, what if you tried? What if it transformed your life or your kid's life or your family's life? So many times I feel like we have to ask the bigger question of not the like short-sighted part of it of like, oh, it's going to be hard. And maybe it's actually going to be a lot easier because it ultimately makes life easier because everybody starts to feel better.
Better.
And I mean, gluten, I can't tell you. And I will have some people that are like, oh, I've tried cutting it out for a couple weeks and I don't feel any difference. But people have to realize that gluten does not just affect your digestive system and cause digestive issues. I'm going to let you talk about what it's doing to our gut, but I think so many times people think, oh, well, I don't get bloated or I don't have any
Hmm.
digestive issues. So they think it doesn't bother them, but there's a lot of other things that gluten's doing. So Dana, you
Yeah.
want to take it away for us? Let's talk
Yeah,
about
look, there are
all of those.
so all of those things. And I think that firstly I will say that 3 weeks isn't long enough to remove out remove out gluten in order for the body to stop reacting to it, because it can take 3 to 6 to 12 months for some people, depending on how reactive they are to gluten. But I just want to start off with some statistics. It's estimated that 54% of American children have been diagnosed with a chronic disorder in 2018, and that figure was only 15% a couple years before that. 15% to 54%. And when I look at that difference, the increase is shocking. This is kids. 1 in 2 have anxiety, asthma, type 1, type 2 diabetes, epilepsy, heart problems. 1 in 5 have allergies. 1 in 6 have developmental delays. And 1 in 68 have autism, which I think has just been revised, and it's something like 1 in 32 now. But why do we think that this rise has occurred so rapidly? And the answer is simple. It all begins in the gut. And that's because 80% of the body's entire immune system is within the gut wall, along with billions of nerve cells and an extensive amount of beneficial gut bacteria. So all of our children's health and our own, I'm just focusing on children here, but all of our health is quite literally connected to everything that occurs in our gut. And so, when we eat gluten, it creates intestinal permeability, which is like leaky gut, because it breaks down the lining of the gut because it's so inflammatory. And so, even if you don't feel it in the gut, all of these other disorders and symptoms are so connected to the gut because 80% of the body's entire immune system is there. The use of antibiotics is on the rise. It's been on the rise for years, but most antibiotics work by killing bacteria or preventing it from growing. But unfortunately, most of these antibiotics can't distinguish between the good and the bad bacteria. And that means they can wreak havoc on the gut's healthy bacteria. And many people actually suffer lasting changes to their gut flora as a result of taking antibiotics. So a large percentage of the children I work with and all the adults out there have been on multiple rounds of antibiotics, and that's in turn compromising the gut. And when the gut is compromised, it's not a huge surprise to see that all of those disorders and illnesses are on the rise
Dana, I
now.
have a quick question for you with
Yes.
this because I love the antibiotic conversation. As a child who was on just asinine amount of antibiotics, which is what part of probably what's led me to all the work that I do as well,
Yes.
right? We have our own stories. Um, are you seeing, I don't know if you collect all this data from all the families you work with, but are you seeing that across the board, kids that have ADHD, have they tended to be on more rounds of antibiotics like from birth?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And usually when I'm doing an interview, I do talk about that. And I wish I had kept a tally on how many kids were actually
Maybe
on
you should start.
antibiotics.
You could
I
start doing like a
know.
little survey because I think it would be
Yes.
really interesting because here, like, just because I work with more adults, I do work with kids
Mm.
sometimes, but I work with adults. God is sending me amazing people, men and women and men who have things that have got missed in the medical world, where people are like, oh, you're fine, all your blood work looks fine, right? And there's really
Mm-hmm.
something deeper, which we won't get into today. But the thing I wanted to say that I see is the commonality amongst most of the adults I work with. They were on a lot of antibiotics as a child. So I
Mm.
think so many times, like as we get older, maybe we change our nutritional ways a little bit or things like that, or we're able to tolerate a little bit more or whatever it might be, or we get used to dealing with aches and pains or digestive issues or whatever it is. But if you've got a lot of health stuff as an adult and you look back as a child and you had a lot, or on a good amount of antibiotics, likely that is like a root piece that caused a lot of problems. So, which is what I love the work that you're doing with kids, because even if a child has been on lots of rounds of antibiotics, there's massive hope. There's a
There
lot we could do.
is.
Anyway, I just thought that was really interesting that you brought that up. And I think you should start surveying your
Yes, I
kids
I
because I would be
definitely want
curious.
to. Yeah, I was so
Yeah.
curious as well. But I can tell you, most of the families we speak to, multiple rounds of antibiotics. And I'm just going on, the countless number of families I've spoken to. But, as I mentioned, they create lasting changes, to your gut flora. And so you need to then work on that gut flora, and you brought up a good point in that, some people, they've been going through this for a long time and they're used to the symptoms, or it hasn't got to a point that it's that bad, they've just been coping with it, or their body's been coping with it. I like to look at it like a bucket, okay? And so we get born with a bucket, and that bucket might be empty when we're born, or it might be slightly have a little bit of stuff in it, depending on how the birth was, how the pregnancy was, and things like that. And so we've got this bucket, and we're exposed to all of these things throughout our childhood and our adult life. And you've got a kid where you've might have been compromised when they're in birth, through the birth process. Like my son, he was born at 38 weeks, but he had premature lung disease, and that only happens to 0.01% of babies over 38 weeks. And so he was in the NICU for 2 weeks on birth. So his bucket started already a little bit full. And then we piled on the antibiotics because of other things that were going on. And then he was exposed to bad food, toxins, and all of these things, until his bucket got so full that it couldn't hold it anymore, and it overflowed. And when it overflows, that's when these symptoms come out. You don't see them until it starts overflowing. Now, some people have really good detoxification systems in their body, and so they may be emptying their bucket all the way through life, and it's not until that might get clogged that symptoms come out later in life. But when you've got a kid that has compromised detoxification pathways and has all of these load in its bucket, and the bucket can't empty, then that's when things like ADHD, allergies, asthma, type 1, type 2 diabetes all of a sudden come out. And so, I like to look at it in that sort of analogy, but definitely going to be starting a survey of the families that we talk with. But I think I just want to tie gut health to brain health and ADHD. And what the gut brain connection means is that in essence our brains are deeply connected to our guts, and if our guts aren't functioning well, our brains won't be able to function well either. And I mentioned that my son had really bad tantrums and meltdowns and emotional dysregulation. Now, 95% of the body's serotonin and 50% of the body's dopamine is produced in the gut. And these neurotransmitters are the ones that help us manage our emotions, balance our mood, and help our cognitive function. And emotional dysregulation for him was huge, and it's very common with kids with ADHD, but many parents don't realize that this emotional dysregulation actually starts in the gut, where the serotonin and the dopamine are made. So the problem then is not the emotions themselves, but the fact that the correct amount of these vital neurotransmitters are not being made in the first place. So by working to improve gut health, many caregivers of children with ADHD find that these emotional dysregulation problems solve themselves. And honestly, it is one of the first symptoms to dissipate. The tantrums reduce in frequency, length of time, severity, and, they may get upset, but they're over it in a couple of minutes, like any normal child. And so that's huge, because that's usually the thing that stops the family living a peaceful life. So that's amazing that it can change in really, really quickly. Now, the brain has many areas involved in gut function, but the main area is the frontal lobe, right just above in between your eyes. And it's the area of the brain that talks to the gut via two-way chemical messages and nerve branches. And the frontal lobe is involved in things like attention and focus and executive function, planning, organizing, problem solving, which are common symptoms of ADHD and other things as well. And so, as you said earlier, like, what if a child hasn't been diagnosed with ADHD, but they are having focus issues? Well, their gut brain connection might be off. Okay. And so, because the frontal lobe is in the brain, many people are under the impression it's the brain that needs care, when in reality, it's also the gut that's causing the problems. I tell a lot of stories. I use a lot of analogies as well. And, I like to think of a sort of, have you ever felt butterflies in your stomach because you were nervous about something?
Oh yeah, of course.
For sure. Maybe it was a first date, which was a very long time ago for me. Gosh, I can't even remember that now. Or a test or a conflict. These are perfect examples of the gut brain connection. Our bodies are perceiving whatever we're nervous about as a stressful situation. And then our brains trigger raw emotions in the gut, resulting in those butterfly feelings or feelings of nausea. So that's the brain talking to the gut. But the reverse is also true. Our guts talk to our brains as well. And so when the digestive system, and specifically the intestinal tract, has higher level of bad bacteria, more than good, it's called gut dysbiosis. And that gut dysbiosis creates inflammation, and that inflammation travels through those connections, the vagus nerve, to the brain. And once this reaches the brain, it creates all of these symptoms like brain fog, inability to focus, confusion, dizziness, poor memory, and a whole host of other, symptoms, even, anxiety and depression. So it's kind of like a highway. The gut and the brain are constantly sending messages back and forth. And when medication is actually prescribed for ADHD, it is often to treat the symptoms in the brain alone, but the medication does absolutely nothing about whatever might be going on in the gut.
And possibly causing even more problems with the gut, right? Because we know a lot of
Yes.
pharmaceuticals can actually cause gut dysbiosis or add to it, I guess. So I
Yes,
think a lot of people
definitely.
don't know that. There's a time and a place for medication, right? Like
Agreed.
there's a time and a place. And sometimes it's a starting point, like it was for you guys. But then when you have, it's never too late, I guess. I think for me, I always want to encourage others. It's like, it's never too late. Even if you've been on something for a long
Yeah.
time, like it's amazing. I'm sure you've seen it too with clients time and time again, you're getting them off of prescriptions. And it's like, it just comes down to addressing what the body needs and working to heal and
Mm-hmm.
get out the toxins and all that. I have a question because I know you talked about detoxification or toxins, right? The detox
Mm-hmm.
bucket getting full. I love talking about detoxification. what are your thoughts with kids and having them do some form? Obviously, like nutrition really is kind of a first line of
Mm-hmm.
things to get the junk out, right? But then if you have a child who is not detoxifying well, like I don't know if you can even describe like what are those symptoms
Yeah.
or signs that might be that a child does not have really good detox pathways, and what do you
Well,
recommend? Like, do you recommend doing sauna, just getting kids to be more active? And they're already active, right? So like maybe
yeah, I've got
like
lots of strategy. I mean, they're so active normally, yes, but I've got lots of strategies. It's hard to tell whether or not someone's detoxification pathways are not working properly, especially in kids, because a lot of the symptoms of ADHD and a lot of the symptoms of all of these disorders indicate that the detoxification pathways are not working well because the body's not able to get rid of what's in there. And so I personally don't love really strong detox protocols for kids. However, just as you mentioned, I always, in my program, we have reducing toxicity as one of the pillars. And, we share lots of strategies around that. Things like, sauna for 10 minutes, 10 minutes at a time. We keep it lower for kids, obviously. Drinking lots of varieties of different spring waters that has different minerals in it, and so obviously water helps the body detox and open up those detoxification pathways. Exercise is huge that we use. Detox baths, so magnesium flakes and baking soda, soaking in that for 20 minutes at a time, a few times a week, really helps with detoxification. Milk thistle, you can buy milk thistle in a tea format, or you can buy it in a powder that you can mix into baked goods or smoothies. Same with dandelion. You can buy it in a tea format. So there's lots of these light detoxification strategies that we use with kids rather than that really heavy detox processes that some people do, like, chelation and things like that. I do also use binders. So there are a number of different types of binders that we use with kids to bind out the toxins that are floating around in the body and taking them out of the body. But I usually like to do that obviously in consultation with someone like myself, a practitioner. Just trying to go off and find a binder for your kid is not what I'm suggesting at all. But definitely the things that I suggest, plus food. There's lots of foods that are awesome, high in antioxidants, salmon and berries and things like that.
yeah, there's so much we can do through food, little tweaks to nutrition, things
Yes.
like that. I love that you said about gentle detoxification because I think there's so much that can be done to just assist the body's natural
Mm-hmm.
ability, especially for kids. I feel like
Yes.
when you give the body the right little bits that it needs, it's amazing how kids
Oh,
are
it's amazing.
they're so resilient, right?
Yeah.
Like for an adult, it might take us way longer, but for kids, I feel like they're so resilient. It's
They
absolutely amazing.
are. And it's in a perfect example with my son. Literally within 2 weeks of us changing his diet and bringing in some of these strategies, he was a different kid. Okay.
That's
Like
amazing.
he could
Yeah.
actually sit down at the dinner table and not get up for the whole dinner time. All of a sudden, he no longer had these massive meltdowns. And that was like 2 weeks. Some kids take longer, but some kids, 2 to 4 weeks, and they're, a different child, which is amazing. And so it may seem really hard, but honestly, I would much rather deal with a gluten-free diet than multiple tantrums every day. I speak to some families and they're going through multiple tantrums a day. That is not
Yeah.
normal. The body is crying out and telling you that, Mum, my body is in a state of inflammation. I need some help.
Yeah, not to mention probably the stress that it can add into the family, the
Oh,
relationships and all of that. And
yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but sometimes I just like to tell people like just get like switch out, like you said, as you run out of things, just switch out to the gluten-free option.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously you have to watch for soy, and I try to
Yeah.
minimize corn. People that have a wheat issue, or do you find corn usually has to go too? kind of across
Yeah.
the board.
Look,
Yeah, it can be.
it is corn's a hard one. I agree. I mean, corn is not great. I will say to families, minimize it, but make sure
Mhm.
it's always non-GMO organic corn if you're
Yeah,
going to do it. And usually look for kids, it's enough without taking that out as well. And so,
it just
just hold on, my
depends.
dog's
Yeah,
barking.
it's
Sorry.
okay. When you run out of regular bread, just go and buy the gluten-free option. I mean, honestly, just those are the initial steps to
Hmm.
help. And then in time, you can tighten it up more, but it's really just making those initial shifts. I mean, I've seen it with kids, and it is amazing how much it can just change your life and your
It
family's life.
can.
And so, anyway, Dina and I are here to help give you all the push. If you need that extra push to like start making the changes, start doing something, it's like pick one thing that was mentioned today and just do it. And I think you'll be amazed at the changes that can happen, right, Dana?
It's amazing, and at times I just stop and I think I read all of these posts from families going through my program about, we had one family the other day. She has three sons, one has autism and two have ADHD, and between two of the boys last year they had been suspended from school 32 times, and she was about to lose her job because she had to leave her job every time they got suspended to go and pick the kids up from school. The year that she was in my program, they got suspended 0 times and they started winning awards. And so,
Amazing.
just that in itself, it's amazing. But at the same time, it's a little bit infuriating that that is not the first port of call when a kid is diagnosed with ADHD. And that is what I'm so passionate about, is it should be food first. Food should come first. When a kid
It
is
should.
diagnosed with ADHD, the doctor should recommend changing the diet first. Hand them a copy of my book, Thriving with ADHD, and, help that family make these changes. Medication can be effective in certain circumstances. But if a child continues to eat processed inflammatory foods like gluten, dairy, and soy, those ADHD symptoms are not going to go away because the foods they eat are exacerbating those symptoms. So, food first means that rather than trying to find a magical pill that's going to fix a child, we clean up their diet instead. And in doing this, we reduce inflammation, and then the symptoms start to reduce because we are getting to the bottom of what's causing these symptoms in the first place.
No, it's amazing. I love the work you're doing. Will you share with everyone a little bit about your program, what it's called, and where they can find it? Because that's why I wanted to have you on, because I like more and more moms, families need your information because, like you said, we're seeing such a rise in so many things that we
Yeah.
can work to decrease.
Yeah, definitely. Look, my company is called the ADHD Thrive Institute, and our program's called the ADHD Thrive Method for Kids, and that's all we do all day long is work with families to reduce those symptoms, and we really guide you step by step from making these dietary changes, from reducing toxin exposure, from opening up the detoxification pathways. We have two different levels. We have one that focuses on things we can control in our environment, in our house, in the food that we put in our body, and then we have our next level program that also includes functional lab testing that we use to identify actually what's going on in that particular individual's body. But as I said, 50% of kids that we've worked with, they do the base program and they don't need to go further with functional lab testing, which is absolutely amazing. And look, it's very different to what you might get at sort of a functional medicine doctor, because you'll go to them, they'll do some labs for you, they'll give you some supplements, and they'll send you on your way. And then you're left to defend everything yourself. How do you make the dietary changes? How do you do all of this? None of that help, but that's what we do. We are there literally every single day, holding your hand for 6 to 9 months, to really get you from where you are now to reducing those ADHD symptoms, to bringing back that peace and that calm to your house, and helping your child thrive at home, thrive at school, and thrive in life. And I've actually, as I mentioned, I've just released a book. It's called Thriving with ADHD. It's a guide to naturally reducing ADHD symptoms in your child. And both my program and my book, are exactly what I needed years ago. There was nothing out there that, was going to help me support my son with ADHD, and I could never find it. And I was constantly Googling for something, for anything that actually might give us some relief. And I struck out time and time again, and there was no book out there or no program out there that could give me all the information. So I created it myself, and I've been able to help, close to 1,000 other families get to the same place as me and my son. And every day I actually pinch myself, because when I think back to what I wanted to be when I grew up, a businesswoman in an office, I never once thought in my mind that I would change people's lives. I never had a desire to be honest. But now that I am, every day I get to watch families go from utter pain to absolute peace and happiness, and that I just can't even describe. So if families want to find out more information, they can find me at my website, which is ADHD Thrive Institute.com, or on Instagram, Facebook, other social platforms at ADHD Thrive Institute. And I'm also on TikTok, which I don't really want to be, but I'm there because I got forced to be there. So
I am not there yet. But Dana, I love all the work you're doing. And if anyone's listening, please, and you're interested, please go check out Dana's programs, her book, and share this episode with anyone else in your life that you know could benefit. Because I think it's just, this is how we're getting the word out, is, it's all just sharing it with other people, because sometimes it's hard to find this stuff when you Google
it
because of how
is.
all that algorithm works. Like, I know I've been in the holistic health space for a long time and things have changed. So by sharing, it's amazing. That's how I meet people. It's word of mouth. It's
Hmm.
how I find the best information. You've got to kind of know where to go. So thank you everybody for tuning in and listening. And Dana, thank you so much for joining me. And again, I'll put all the links below to the show notes. But for all of you listening, if you haven't yet left a review, head on over to iTunes or wherever you listen to my Core Connections podcast and leave a review, because again, that also helps to grow the show and change others' lives as well. So thank you all so much. And Dana, thank you again.
Thanks, Erica.